All right. Thank you for coming out. Really appreciate it. As always. Uh, so yeah, today, as you can see, and as you um know at this point, today we're going to be talking about music theory. This session will undoubtedly be a long one, so I hope you have like water with you or a snack or something. Um, but yeah, the goal with this session is actually twofold. I really wanted to push like as much beginner knowledge as possible, as uh, as well as some intermediate topics. So if you have no knowledge at all about music theory and you're watching this and just want to learn a couple things, cool. Hopefully this will give you everything you need to know to make some music. But if you do know a few things or if you know a lot, hopefully this either um, makes you learn something new or just refreshes you on a couple topics you already know about. So getting right into it, um, just a quick overview of some of the stuff we're going to cover. We're going to start off super simple, just notes, intervals, that good stuff, as well as the note lengths. After that, we're going to get into scales, just a few of them, nothing too fancy. And then the scale degrees, just so you can tell where notes are in the scale, and that will then let us build chords. We'll briefly go over modes because they're essentially just scales except different slightly. Then over to chords. We'll cover a bunch of common chords, a bunch of less common chords, and then just a big list of them. Time signatures, we're going to get into a bit more depth than you might expect with that. Considering I'm a progressive rock nerd, I love weird time signatures, and they do not get enough credit. So, absolutely wanted to go hard on that one. And after that, some melodic and harmonic concepts that don't really fall anywhere into theory per se, but are still pretty integral to songwriting and that sort of thing. And right at the end, some rhythmic concepts because you can't have music without a rhythm, and then some of the stuff that you can look into after that. So right into it, starting off nice and simple with notes. Um, if you've encountered music at any time in your life, you have heard notes. Even if you haven't encountered music in your life, somehow you've heard notes. Music is made of them. They're essentially just vibrations of air at certain frequencies that can either resonate or be dissonant with each other. And each note in the Western music world is assigned to a certain frequency. So A4 is 440, and that is how a lot of instruments are tuned. Like guitars are tuned to 440. And yeah, that's what that means. There are 12 notes in the Western music world. Just so I don't need to repeat in the Western music world a ton. Most of this is going to be relating to Western music theory, since admittedly I know basically nothing about any Eastern or other cultural music theories, just the Western stuff. But yeah, there are 12 notes. A note can be one of three things. It could be natural, it could be sharp, or flat. I put all the symbols there. And right there in the middle of the screen is a piano with each of the notes. And as you can see, it has, all the white keys don't have sharps or flats. And then the middle ones, you have sharps and flats. All right. So intervals are directly related to notes. Being one note away from them, or one note away from something, that is one interval. And being one note away from that is also called a semitone. So one interval is one semitone. So examples of that would be from B to C. That's just B and then C. There's no sharps or flats in between them. But if you want to increase that, two whole notes or two notes away is a whole tone. So that would be something like C to D, which has D sharp in the middle, or B to D sharp would be B, C, D sharp, and so on and so forth. But usually things will be measured in semitones just because it's easier. And now sharp notes are when you raise a note one semitone, and then flat notes are when you lower a note one semitone. So C flat doesn't technically exist, but it is B. It's just B. B natural. Or alternatively, B sharp would be C, because there's no sharp note between the two, or flat note between the two. That is essentially how it still works. Those technically are correct, but people won't like you if you do stuff like that. So just wanted to share that anyways. All right, note lengths. So this is a very important thing, even though it's two things on this slide and then a picture. But this is the length. Yeah, it's the length of a note. And it's basically just derived from cutting bigger notes into pieces. And it all starts with a whole note, which is the length of one bar. And then you get half notes, which are both 2 beats each. Or actually, yeah, a whole note is 4 beats. And then you have half notes, which are 2 beats each. Quarter notes, which are 1 beat each. And then you further divide it into eighths, which there's 8 notes, or 8 eighth notes in one 4x4 or 4/4 bar. And then 16th notes are chopping the eighth notes in half as well. So everything is just chopping it in half again. It's not too complex. It's pretty understandable. But where it gets fun is adding a dot. So dotted notes are a thing. And it's basically you just add the value of one row down to it. So a dotted quarter note would be the length of a quarter note plus an eighth note. A dotted half note would be 3 beats. A dotted whole note would be 6. A dotted eighth note would be an eighth note plus a 16th note. So it's like a 1.5 times modifier to the note. Is an interesting way of thinking about it, but it still works if that works for you. And along with the length of notes, you also have the length of rests. And this is a pretty good graphic that I found. It shows the note, the rest that corresponds to it. So the whole note, it's an upside down top hat. That's how I've always learned it since I was a kid. The half rest is an upright top hat. The quarter note is a little squiggle. Eighth note looks like a 7, and 16th note is 2 eighth rests stacked on top of each other. And on the side there, you got the number of beats that it corresponds to, as well as what it looks like in a single 4/4 measure. So as you can see, it keeps dividing in 2 as you go down. And 32nd notes do exist. 64th notes do exist, but generally you're not going to be running into them unless you're doing some really weird stuff, or just have an extremely slow tempo. But those exist, but these are generally the ones you'll be using. All right, now that we've got notes, we got the values of notes, which are all the names of them. So that's like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and all the sharps and flats. Now we can put scales together with them. So what is a scale? It is a set of notes that is ordered by pitch. So each note's position in the scale is called a scale degree. So the first scale degree is what the scale starts on. So for the C major scale, that would be C. For the A major scale, it would be A, and so on and so on. But scales are basically what you use to figure out chords, progressions, and the key of a piece. Not always, though. You can have key changes. You can have borrowed chords, which are chords taken from other scales that don't necessarily fit into the one you're using. But all that aside, scales generally provide a nice framework to figure out the chords and progressions for your song. The easiest scale to learn is the chromatic scale, and it's the easiest because it just hits every single note on the way up to an octave. So I'll get into what an octave is in a couple minutes, but as you can see, it's literally doing every single note until it hits C again. That's the chromatic scale. It doesn't matter where it starts. If it starts on A, though, that's the A chromatic scale. If it starts on C, it's the C chromatic scale. But generally, nobody really says that since every single one has the exact same notes in it. And now we got the major scale, which is the basis for pretty much everything. This is the default for music, especially for scale building. And it is a 7-note scale, technically, the 8th note being an octave. So the 8th note, it's an octave, as you can see on this one and the chromatic scale. There's 2 C's on it. What an octave is it's the same note except higher or lower. So C but an octave higher would be the C on the right, and taking the C on the right, if you want an octave down, that'd be the one on the left. It's generally as simple as that. But yeah, the C major scale is the basis for pretty much everything. What you do to make it on a piano is you do one whole step, one whole step, one half step, whole, 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 half. And that will essentially skip all of the sharps and flats for the C major scale, making it nice and easy to learn. This is why C major is usually the first one you learn when you're learning piano. And yeah, the best notes to use for the major scale are the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, etc. But generally sticking to the 1, 3, 5, we'll get into this a bit later, is the best way to go for more simple chords, and even some stylishness if you want to get into inversions without spoiling too much. So with major, you have the minor scale as well. There are multiple different types of the minor scales, but this one is just the natural minor scale, which is also called just the minor scale. The minor scales, as you can kind of assume from the name, they're used to evoke sadness and a bit more emotion, melancholy from the listener than the major scale, which tends to be a lot more upbeat. But how it does this is it lowers the 3rd, lowers the 6th, and lowers the 7th in the scale. So C minor has E flat, A flat, and B flat, as opposed to C major, which all those are, well, E, A, and B. So for this interesting thing, you just take the skips for the major scale and just shift it down a bit. So instead of whole, 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 half, whole, 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 half, it's whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, and that'll give you the framework for the scale, no matter what note you start on. Usually when it's written in sheet music, it's denoted by a lowercase m or min. It's also sometimes denoted with a minus symbol. Not as often, though. That's mostly just in some jazz real books or some jazz sheets from what I've encountered. But M and min for minor, those are usually the most common ways you'll see it. Interesting thing, like I said about it, just shifting the intervals between the notes. A minor and C major use the exact same notes, and this makes them a special thing called relative major and minor scales, which we will get into a little bit later when we get into modes. But yeah, one last thing about major and minor is that they're also sometimes called the chord's quality or the scale's quality. So a minor chord or a minor scale has a minor quality to it, and vice versa for major. And now with the natural minor out of the way, you got the first fancy scale of the evening, the harmonic minor scale. It's the exact same as the natural minor, except the 7 is back to where it is originally. So it's still got a flat 3 and a flat 6, and those are the only differences from the major scale. So instead of the 7 being lowered, you skip 3 notes, so a whole and a half step to get to the 7th, and then just a half back to the octave. It's not the most important one you want to know. Definitely go for the major and minor first before going to the harmonic one. But it can be useful in a lot of situations. It's interesting for a lot of classical stuff and a lot of jazzy stuff, which is where you find most interesting chords and scales, to be honest. But another tool in the arsenal is always useful. And the last of the 3, you got melodic minor scales. The last of the 3 minor scales, I mean. This is an interesting one. It is natural minor with a raised 6 and 7, but only when you're going up. Whenever you're going down, it's just a normal natural minor. So going up, it's just a flat third. And the rest of it is the exact same as a major scale, and then when you're going down, it's normal minor. This one is also not super needed. This one I would argue is less needed than the previous one, but you can use it if you want. That's what it's here for. All right, and scale degrees. I kind of got into this a little bit with the word octave earlier, but generally you don't need to know the names of these things, but you should absolutely remember a couple things about it. The one note, or the first note, the tonic, is easily the most important note in the scale. It's the resolution. It's where you'll feel the least amount of tension when playing that note with this scale, or with any scale. The dominant is the second most important. This one is also got a lot of release of tension to it, which is why the 1 and the 5, when you put those together, that's a power chord or a 5 chord. That's a very strong, powerful chord. Like it's very good for emphasizing something, which is why guitarists use it all the time, and because it's easy on guitar. But generally, the 1 and the 5, the two most important. After that, you have the third most important, which is the third or the mediant. This note determines whether it's major or minor, so it's very important. And once again, if you want strong, albeit basic chords, using the 1, 3, and 5, that will give you the strength of the 1 and the 5, as well as give you the chord's quality with the third. When we get into chords in the next section, we'll be using all these numbers just to keep everything easy to read and to keep it transferable between different scales. And one last thing I want to note here, you'll note that there's a flat 7 as well as a 7, which is the subtonic in the leading tone. The leading tone is only in major scales, or well, it's mostly in major scales, to be honest. It's in some minor scales or some other scales, but the subtonic is only in minor scales and other similarly slightly more dissonant scales. Both of them lead very well into the tonic. The leading tone is a bit more of a, hey, go back to the tonic kind of note, whereas the subtonic, it could do other things with it. But yeah, those two do exist. They both have different names, just because both are used very commonly and have totally different feels between them. All the other notes you don't generally need to know too much about, to be completely honest. At least you don't need to remember the names unless you're going into like a jazz program or expect to talk to a lot of seasoned jazz musicians, because they're usually a little stingy about this kind of thing. All right, now moving swiftly on to modes. This kind of bridges the scale. Bridges the gap. I don't know why I said Gale. I'm thinking about Dark Souls still. But it bridges the gap between chords and scales, in my eyes. Modes are usually left a bit later in music education. Like for me at least, I didn't learn it until high school. And that's when everything really started to click towards the end of it. But modes are super important. Even if you just have the basics of it, it will help you immensely with songwriting, melody writing, pretty much everything. Modes, or the Greek modes, as this infographic calls them, they are different variations of the major scale, just starting on one of the different notes of another scale. So that might sound confusing, but it's as simple as just shifting the major scale down a note or up a note. And each of them have their own name. They're all Greek words, which is probably why they're originally called the Greek modes. But they are different scales in the same key. That is the biggest takeaway. So much like major and minor having different feelings to them, each of the modes offers a really different mood, tone, and vibe. So writing in different modes can really help make your music a little more interesting to listen to. And there is one mode for every scale degree. So 1, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each of those has a different mode associated with it, which you can see on the side. And I kind of wish I kept this for the rest of the section about modes, because it's about to get a lot less readable in 3, 2, 1. But basically, this is a list of all of them again, except this time I opted to add a couple different things. I added the starting note of the scale in the middle column. So that's just where on the major scale it starts. So Dorian, as you can see, it starts on the 2. Phrygian, it starts on the 3, and so on. And on the rightmost column, I put how you would alter a major scale to get it to be one of the modes. So Dorian, you can take a major scale and just start on the 2nd, or if you wanted it to be on the same root, just lower the 3rd and the 7th, and so on for all of them. As you can see, there's also the 2nd column, which has a number, a Roman numeral, which indicates the scale degree or the chord of it. But it also is either lowercase or uppercase, and right at the bottom, Locrian has a little circle. So what those are is those differentiate whether it's major, minor, or diminished. So the major modes, which each of them, as you could probably tell in the far right column, each of these major modes have a 1, 3, and 5, just completely natural. This then means that if you're trying to use major chords with them, using the 1, the 4, the 5 of the root scale, this is a really safe way to go. And Ionian, just to be super clear about it, it is the major scale, completely unaltered. Yeah, Ionian is just a fancy way of saying this scale just starts on the first note of the major scale and is therefore the major scale. So yeah, those are the major modes. You got Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. Then you got the minor modes, which are all the lowercase ones. Similarly, or as you would expect, with all the major ones having a natural 1, 3, 5, the minor ones have a 1 flat 3, 5 in all of them. So these are all the minor chords. And the one last thing to note here is that the Aeolian scale is the minor scale. So it's got the flat 3, flat 6, flat 7. Or you just start on the 6th degree of the major scale. So the 6th degree of C major is A. Therefore, A minor is C major. And that's how you find relative major and minors. And now for the last one that we left out. The Locrian scale is a diminished mode. It's a weird one. Basically, what diminished means is that it's super dissonant. You generally don't need to worry about this one, because most people don't use it to write. If you really want to, go for it. It's a good musical challenge. But the reason why it's diminished is because it has a 1, a flat 3, and a flat 5. So yeah, that's a flat 5 usually means it's diminished. Alright, now away from modes, I'm going to take a quick sip of water before we get into chords. Alright, so chords, they use scales to make good sounds. And that is pretty much the easiest way to explain what chords are. But in the most basic form, they are multiple notes played at once. And it creates either dissonance when something sounds super weird, like the diminished scale or diminished chords, or it sounds nice and consonant with each other. So like a nice major scale or nice major chords, like C major, it's very pleasing. And yeah, there's very little tension in it. But chords, there are different types of chords. Triads are the most common ones. You'll see these everywhere. They're one of the first things you learn on piano. And these are where the 1, 3, 5 things come in. That is a major triad. But triads appear everywhere in all types of music at all times, since they are just chords with 3 notes in them. It doesn't matter what the note is, it's just 3 notes in a chord from one scale. Chord letters usually denote the root, so if there was a C major, it would just be called a C. If there was a C minor, it would be C, M, or min. So usually it's the root and then the quality of the chord, and that will tell you what to play. If you're reading sheet music, or if you're wanting to write it down somewhere, you write that down. And I alluded to qualities a little bit earlier with scales, but there's a few more than just major and minor. There's augmented, which is usually denoted by a plus sign. There's diminished, and there's half diminished. And dominant seventh is also a weirdly specific one. We'll get into all these on the next slide. But yeah, those are just a few different types of chord qualities that you'll run into. So a bunch of chord types. I forgot this slide existed. So by next slide, I mean now it's the next slide. But a couple other types that you'll run into, or should run into, because they're great for spicing things up, are add chords, sus chords, and it took all my willpower not to say sus, super weird, and chord extensions, which, put simply, add chords, they're a chord plus an additional note, as notated. So you have a C triad, so that's C, E, G, but a C add 2, you would add in the 2 in there. So that'd be C, D, E, G. And then similarly in add 9, the 2 and the 9 are the same note, but the 9 shows that the octave, that it's the octave up, and that is important. So a C add 9, as opposed to a C add 2, the D would be after the G. It would be the highest note. Similarly, but a little different, sus chords, I'm extremely immature, but yeah, the third in a sus chord is replaced by a major 2 or a 4. So instead of keeping the C, E, G for a C major triad, you would replace the E with a D and a C sus 2. And with a C sus 4, you would replace it with an F. So that basically shifts the third down to a major second or up to a fourth. I should clarify right now, since I just realized I didn't talk about this. A major second is just a normal second. A minor second is when it's lowered by 1 semitone. So when somebody says like, oh, a minor whatever note it is, that would be basically meaning it's down one note. But the 4 and the 5, those are both perfect. I really should have got into that. I completely forgot about that when I was making this, so I apologize there. But moving swiftly on, extensions are basically taking the chord and adding onto it in very specific ways. So an add chord, you take a C add 9, and that just slaps the D at the end of it. But you get a C9 or a C7, and it adds every single note, or every other note in between the normal triad and the note that's notated. So a C7, that's the most common extension you'll see. So that's just adding the 7th in. Or it'll add a flat 7th usually. But for a C7, that's just adds a B flat in there. But a C9, that would add a B flat and then a D. So a C11th, that would add the B flat, the D, and then the F. So you got to keep track of that when you have extremely long and confusing chord extensions, which you will see in jazz a lot. But generally speaking, sus chords are great. You should use them. 7th extensions are great. You should use them. And add chords are great. You should absolutely use them. And now some common chords, and then on the next slide we're going to get into a couple less common chords, but are still good to know. So like I said earlier, the power chord is also called the 5 chord. That's a 1-3 or not a 1-3-5, just a 1-5. Sometimes you can have the octave in there. Most of the time you do if you're a guitarist. So 1-5 or 1-5-8. It's super positive sounding most times, but generally it's very powerful. So if you use it in a negative context or a minor context, like going from a minor second to the 1, so that's just one semitone, that generally gives you a very like, ooh, that's kind of dissonant sound, which is where you get stuff like metal coming in, and a lot of darker music like that. Major chord, you have the 1-3-5, super simple. That's what everything's based off of for the most part. You have the minor triad, which is the 1-flat-3-5, diminished. Like I said earlier, with the Locrian scale, it's 1-flat-3-flat-5. You have the half diminished seventh, which is, I don't know why I put that before the other ones, but whatever. That's 1-flat-3-flat-5 with a flat seventh on there. You have the major seventh, which is just a normal 7 on there. You have the minor seventh, which is a flat 3 and a flat 7. And a minor major seventh, which is a minor chord with a major seventh on it. I hate minor major sevenths. They are super confusing. But those 3, like half diminished major seventh, minor seventh, or I guess 4, the minor major seventh, and then with the dominant seventh, because I forgot about that one. Those ones are all very confusing. Essentially, when you just have the word seventh, for some reason, it defaults to a minor seventh. So you take a minor seventh and just slap it on something. That's why the C7 had a B flat on it. But a C major seventh would just be a normal B. And a B, or a C minor major seventh, a lot of words are getting stuck in my mouth right now, that would be an E flat as well as a normal B. And last but not least, dominant seventh, it's just a flat 7 with a major triad below it. So those are some common chords. You will see these all the time. Now for a couple of additional chords that you will see somewhat often, and just a couple more I guess formulas to create chords. You have the augmented chords, which is a sharp 5th. I love augmented chords. They are really cool. It's a really interesting sound. I don't really know how else to put it. It's bright usually, but not extremely bright. Like, it's still got a bit of dissonance to it. And it's really cool. You should absolutely experiment with these. You got add 2s, which, as I said earlier, it's the 1, 2, and then the 3, and then the 5. A sus2, alternatively, just replaces the 3 with a 2. A sus2 is really good. I love it. You have sus4s, which replaces the 2 or the 3 with the 4. And then you have the add x, or whatever it is, and then it will add each subsequent number of note that it needs to. And, of course, you can mix these. So an augmented add 2 chord would be 1, 2, 3, sharp 5. Or an augmented sus4 chord, which are really cool. I recommend those. Would be a 1, 4, sharp 5 as well. Or you can add something to it, so just to make this Frankenstein's chord even better, let's say an augmented sus4 add 7, why not? So you have the 1, 4 sharp 5, and then the 7 on top of that. So you can mix and match a lot of these things, and you can get some really cool combinations. I find that a 1-4-6 chord sounds really cool, which is also just an inversion, which we will get to very shortly. And by shortly, I mean right now. Inversions are really cool. These add so much life to your music when you use them, and can help with leading voices, which we'll get into towards the end of the session. But what inversions are, as you would expect from the name, is it kind of inverts the chord a bit while keeping the same notes. So it changes the lowest note from the chord away from being the root to one of the different notes. So a C major triad, you can see that in the root position is what it's called when it's just the normal triad. So that's C, E, G. And then you have the first inversion, which is you move the C to the top, and then it's C over E. So then looking at it from the bottom to the top would be E, G, C. And then second inversion is you take the new bottom note and move that up an octave as well. You can move things up or down an octave. It's completely up to you. It really adds to a lot of different texture. It's really cool, all the things you can do with this. It's really interesting. But the biggest takeaway with inversions is that the more notes in a chord, the more inversions it can have. So triads, as you can see here in the example, they only have 2 inversions. But if you have a four note chord, wow, like a 7th chord, that would have a 3rd inversion on top of that. So the 3rd inversion for a C7 chord would be B flat, and then C, and then E, and then G. So makes it really cool. There's a lot you can do with that. And yeah, you can do that as many times as you want. You have a 20 note chord for some reason. If you have 6 hands, then you can absolutely make a lot of inversions with that and just go nuts. But at that point, it might be a little hard because that's every single note multiple times, but that's fine. Voicings, similar to inversions. These are just different ways to play the chord using the same notes. And this is differently. It's just the way the chord is structured. So the most common two are the closed position, which is the most compact voicing. That's just a normal triad. That's like C, E, G, just with 2 steps in between them on the staff. But there's also the open position, which, as you can see in the example on the right, the C is all the way down at the bottom. It's in the second last row of the stave. And it also has another note, which I think that's G. So not only does an open position let you have a lot more space in the chord, but it also lets you do different octaves of things just for a lot of neat textures as well. If you take anything away from this session and it's just 1 or 2 things, I would honestly say it's this slide and inversions. They're probably the most 2 important things to help your chords a bit more, or be a bit more unique and flow better between each other. Which, speaking of flow, we'll get to that eventually. I've not forgotten. But before that, we're gonna get into one of my favorite stuff. One of my favorite things, the fun stuff. I really can't speak today. I really apologize for that. But yeah, time signatures. Put very dumbly, it is when the notes. And it also dictates how long a bar is. This generally isn't super applicable to a lot of DAWs, since you can get away with just using weirdly shaped bars for different time signatures, but with sheet music it is absolutely integral to know this stuff. And for writing music, I know that a lot of people, myself included for a time, get locked in 4/4 because that's just the default unless you're doing a waltz. But kind of breaking out of that and learning more about other time signatures is a great way to make your music a lot more unique, add a lot more flair to it. And I mean, hey, most games, most pieces of media, most movies, I wouldn't say most popular music, but a lot of popular music, surprisingly, does have time changes in it, different time signatures. So it's definitely something to know. But put simply, it defines how to divide notes into a bar for readability. So there's 3 types. You have simple, compound, and complex. the three on the bottom are just examples. They are not, they don't line up to simple, compound, and complex. It lines up with the first two being simple, and then the second one is compound, I believe. But yeah, let's get right into what those three words mean. So starting off, just with normal time signatures, on the top note, or on the top number, it's the number of beats in a measure or bar. And the bottom number, that is a division of a whole note that counts as one beat. So a 4, that is 4 beats in one bar, and one bar is a whole note. So it's 4 beats, 1 bar. The bottom number, I already said that. So when you take the bottom number and change it from a 4, so like a half note, that means 2/2, that is 2 half notes, are one. No, it's not. It's 2 quarter notes or 1 beat. It gets a little confusing sometimes. I haven't brushed up on this since last year when I did this session, so I apologize if I have any hiccups when I run into this. But generally, what it means is when the top number is, or whatever the top number is, that's the amount of beats you're counting. And the bottom number is usually the beat value. So that just helps with counting. So if it's 4/8, you're counting 1 and 2 and 3 and, or 1 and 2 and, I guess, because that would be 4/8 notes. But yeah, 4/4, most common time. I'm just gonna move on from that. 4 beats, 1 quarter note is equal to 1 beat per bar. The most common time, you've heard it. I don't need to explain what 4/4 is. You all know exactly what it is. It is 1, 2, 3, 4. You know it. You've heard it in everything. So simple meter. This is where 4/4 is. And simple meter, put simply, is when the top number is either 2, 3, or 4. They are binary beats, which is when the beats are equal to a division of 3 on the denominator. So 3/4 is 3 quarter notes. You get something like 2/4. The weird example that I messed up on, it is 2 quarter notes. You got 2/8, 2/8 notes, and so on and so on. This is a great infographic for just figuring out all of that if you want to experiment with different simple meters. But yeah, 3 as the top number is usually what's considered a waltz. And it offers a very different feel from 4/4 while still being super common. I guarantee you've heard it a lot. Yeah, it's very common in a lot of music, especially in ballads. It is very noticeable. But yeah, now moving on to compound meter, which is a little more complicated. It is when the beat is divided into 3 equal parts. So it doesn't matter what the denominator is, similarly to the previous slide with simple meter. But the top number is what matters. So these things are also called ternary beats. This is when 1 beat is equal to 3 of the denominator. So 3/8 is also a ternary because 1 beat is 1 dotted quarter note. But a couple examples of compound meter, you have 6/8, which is 2 beats of 1.5 beat values, with the denominator value being in 8th note. You have 9/8, which is 3 1.5 value notes, 12/8, which is 4 of the dotted quarters, and 6/4, which is 2 dotted half notes. So compound meter, you will almost always, if not always, see a dotted note as the beat value. Alright, and now complex meter. This is where it gets really fun. This is probably the most scary looking slide that I've gone to at this point. But complex meter isn't too scary once you figured it out. It's basically invented by jazz in the 1900s. Uh, like a lot of common and even uncommon musical things. Jazz did a lot for music, so that's why I've been bringing it up so much. But complex meter, it is a mix of binary and ternary beats. So um, you get something like 6/8, and then you get another thing like 2/8. That is a binary beat plus the 6/8 ternary beat, and then you get something like 8/8. Which, looking at that, you'll think, wait a minute, isn't that just 4/4 with an extra step? It absolutely is. But what it is in practice is two dotted quarter notes and then a normal quarter note. Just because it's two ternary beats back to back and then a binary beat. So that's why it gets interesting, because it's all about counting at this point. So 5/8 is another moderately common one, as well as 5/4. So 5/8 in the example here, it's a dotted quarter note and then a quarter note. So it's 1 and 2 and, like, that's how you would count it. And the reason you would do that is because the 1 and the 2 have the emphasis, because that's where the binary or ternary beat are. A couple other things to note about this: they can also be seen as two time signatures added together. So something like 7/8 or 7/4 could be 3/4 plus 4/4, and that would give you 7/4, which would be a complex meter. And that is a really good way to visualize it as well, because what is 7/8? It's a beat of 4/4 plus a beat, or plus a bar of 3/4. So 1 and 2 and then 3 and and that is 1 bar. So that's 7 beats, 1 bar. It's 2 quarter notes and then a dotted quarter. Another really cool thing about this, I know I'm just kind of going off on a tangent at this point, but this is important and it's a bit of a complex topic. But something really cool about this is that you can have two bars of the exact same complex meter back to back, but they sound completely different rhythmically, even if you're just playing the emphasized beat. And that is because you can flip it, and you can move stuff around to be wherever you want it to. So for the 5/8 example, just because it's simple, you can do the dotted quarter note first and then the quarter note, or you can do the quarter note first and then the dotted quarter note. So that's the difference between 1 and 2 and versus 1 and 2 and or just for simple number counting, you can have 1 2 3 1 2 or 1 2 1 2 3, which when you're like producing that rhythm or just playing it on something, they're totally two different things. And you can apply that to any of them. You can apply that to 11/8. You can mix things around a lot. Like you can do 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3. You can do 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. You could put it anywhere you want, and it's really cool for that. So doing something like that can give you a lot of cool results. Like the song Schism by Tool uses alternating 5/8 and 7/8. And the 7/8 in it is basically an extension of the 5/8. So the main beat of that is 1 2 1 2 3. That's the 5/8 bar, and then 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 for the 7/8 bar. So mixing things around, moving things around, using different time signatures together, all that stuff can do a lot of really cool things for your music. I highly recommend experimenting with that kind of thing. And yeah, I'll move on and take a sip of my water real quick, just because this slide has a lot of information on it. Oh. But one last thing I will note about weird time signatures. If you want to get into it, I would 120,000% recommend just listening to music a lot with different time signatures and different feels, and really trying to feel the beat to it and feel the rhythm of it. I grew up as a drummer initially. Well, not initially. After I learned piano, I wanted to hit things because I was a kid with a lot of energy, so I learned drums, and it really, I would say, helped me learn time signatures, because when I'm listening to a song, I'm like, okay, and try to feel out the rhythm. I would very highly recommend doing that if you want to learn a lot of these more complex rhythmical ideas. And even if you're not a drummer, doing this will 100% increase um, not just your understanding of it, but your understanding of how to use it, um, and your ability to use it to make more interesting um, or more thematically relevant pieces. Because you can have something like that that is thematically relevant. Like the Tool example again, just because I love Tool, with Schism. The entire lyrics of the song, all the like the whole theme of it is a divide between two parties that can't um that just really can't see eye to eye or can't connect on anything anymore. Um and having two complex meters beside each other, um just back to back, it really does it there's a bit of swaying throughout that song, and it does reinforce the theme of it, and you can feel it in the music. Um so doing something like that to take your music to another level, highly recommend it. But at the end of the day, time signatures, like I kind of said at the beginning, um, it is mostly only applicable to sheet music. But beyond that, it is almost entirely just feel and readability. Like if you can feel out a 3/4 beat, then you don't necessarily need to know how to write it. Um, just as long as you can feel it out and figure out, okay, this note lands here, this note lands here, and this is generally how I want it to feel. That's, I would argue, the most important part about it. But with sheet music, if you're reading sheet music and it says 3/4, you're gonna want to know how to phrase your stuff. You're gonna want to know how to actually use it. Um, but yeah, with DAWs, you can take it or leave it. FL Studio's um, time signature setting thing isn't super friendly to prog. Like my when I was writing my album, one of the songs had a couple dozen time changes in it, and one part was in 13/8. I don't know why I left all those time changes in there, because at the end of the day, it just made everything more complicated for me when I could have just not used that at all, kept everything aligned to the grid normally, since it does leave it like that, and just not worry about anything moving or getting out of time. But yeah, with that, the most important thing is just have a metronome and keep track of the one of each bar, especially if you're recording. That's what I did whenever I was listening to the metronome and recording something, and I'd be like, oh, the one just happened, but I start on the 3 because it's a weird bar. So yeah, just keep track of that and you should be fine. All right, now we have covered almost everything that we covered last year. And now moving on to a few things that I did not even think of to cover last year. Or if I did think about it, there wasn't really enough time. And we're almost pushing an hour, so hopefully I'll speed through this next part. But this is super important. It'll really help out with your writing for music, and that's melodic and harmonic concepts. And then after that, we'll get into rhythm a bit more. So melodic and harmonic, those are two fun sounding words. What do they mean? Melody, it's a memorable series of notes. That's a very vague definition, I know, but it's the best one that's out there. Essentially, it is a part of the music that's recognizable separate from the rest of the music. So take something like bum ba 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 ba. We all know what that is. That's the main melody of the Star Wars theme. That that note, or that string of notes that I just parroted, that is the melody. Whereas something like the harmony would be all of the notes that are played alongside that melody that either reinforces it or adds a bit of dissonance to it. But harmony can only exist with a melody. And yeah, they're just additional lines that are either above or below it that add to the music. So take something like a barbershop quartet. That's a great example. You have one person generally doing the main melody, and then you have all the other harmonic pieces. So they're either singing on the third of the scale, or they're doing like a fifth or something, or they're doing the bass line. All of that is harmony. Even if it's just the same as the melody except an octave lower, that is still a harmony line. But since this is Game Sound Club, and I do talk about vertical and horizontal music a lot, especially with adaptive music, melody is the horizontal aspect of music, so that's going left to right in the music, whereas harmony, that is another bar stacked on top of it, or that is another instrument playing at the same time, so that's the vertical aspect in there. Chord progressions. Once again, this is integral to the horizontal side of music, and it's kind of necessary for music. It's not entirely necessary, like you can get away with not changing chords, but it would be hard to make that interesting for the listener after more than like 30 seconds, I would say. But you can get away with it. So chord progressions, that's just chords changing each bar or every couple of notes to show change in the music. A super common one is the 2-5-1 chord progression. It is extremely common. It is heard everywhere, and it resolves itself very well. It's used a lot in a lot of classical video game music. It's used a lot in pop music. It's pretty much everywhere. You can't get away from this. So yeah, minor 2, and then a 5, and then a 1 resolves itself beautifully. And yeah, chord progressions are very important for the next slide, something that I alluded to earlier. Voice leading. So this takes all the best parts of chord progressions, all the best parts of inversions and different voicings of chords, and just kind of mashes them all together. So what voice leading is, that is voicing chords in a way that keeps things smooth when changing chords. So this usually results in moving a voice the shortest possible distance. And the way to do that most commonly is to look for similar notes or common notes between the two chords and then just connect them. And then through that, you just invert the chords to make it a bit more smooth. So on example 1 here, this was just a quick mock-up I made in FL Studio. It is an A major triad going to a D major triad. But as you can see there, they both share an A. So for example 2, what I did is I just moved the A down an octave, and when you play those two, it flows a lot better. And same with example 3, moving both A's together. It just keeps it flowing a bit better. And yes, sometimes you do want the high note, sometimes you do want that jump. It can absolutely be something you want, but generally, if you're writing a bass line or something, you're going to want to do something like this. And yeah, writing a leading bass line like this, or even just melodic lines, harmonic lines especially, doing this is pretty much integral to most forms of music. All right, and last but certainly not least, rhythmic concepts. So for most of the session today, I've been talking about like notes, chords, that sort of thing. But you're gonna need interesting ways to string them together. Time signatures is a really good intro to that, especially the weird time signatures. But even just in 4/4, there's so much that can be done to make it interesting. Like I said before, I was a drummer before I learned guitar or bass, which I am mainly a guitarist now. But it absolutely influenced how I write now. Uh, and something I consistently find is that when I'm writing something or learning a song, one of my biggest focuses is on the rhythm of everything and the pulse of the music, the interplay between all the elements, all the instruments and stuff. And I find it's often overlooked a lot of the time. So we're just gonna look through some concepts that I find are pretty applicable to rhythm, as well as writing. But at the end of the day, all this will result in more engaging and interesting compositions, hopefully. Because even the simplest pieces of music employ some of this stuff. Um, like really simple music, and you would not expect it. Um, and rhythmic ideas come up like this all the time, so it's really important to know some of this stuff. All right, so first thing here, just for rhythm, we have quarter notes, we have eighth notes, all that good stuff. But what happens when you have different note groupings within the same space? That is when you get into tuplets. So that's triplets, quintuplets, sextuplets, so on. Generally, you don't go beyond quintuplets. If you even get to quintuplets, triplets are fairly common. Especially in swing beats, you would throw in the last note of a triplet just to um add to the swing feel. Um, but basically, what these are, they're groups of notes that are played within another note's length. Um, so the picture on the right is honestly a perfect, just kind of infograph of what this is. So a common thing you see is a triplet of eighth notes, or an eighth note triplet. It is equal to two eighth notes. And same thing with quarters. Quarter triplets are the same length as two quarter notes. Um, and generally, when you're learning this, a good thing to know is triplet to sound it out. So quarter, triplet, and when you fit those into the same length, it will flow really interestingly. And this isn't to be confused with 3/4 or any sort of um, waltzy kind of feel. But these can be thrown in into 4/4 to add to a waltzy feel if you wanted to. But the reason I bring this up is because it's a really important part of, like I said, swing grooves, but also polyrhythms, which is one of my other favorite concepts to talk about because it's really cool, and is kind of limited to just jazz and weird prog stuff. And it absolutely should get out because it's used a lot more than people think. But before we get to polyrhythm, we got to start off with polymeter, just because it's arguably a little easier to understand. So polymeter, when you take that word, you split it up, you get polymeter. It's multiple meters happening at the same time, so it's either two or more. So normally a piece is just written in 4/4 or 3/4, whatever it is. But with polymeter, you have the 4/4, and then you have another one. So the beat tempo is the same for both of the lines. So for this example, a quarter note in the top one is the same as a quarter note in the bottom one, but the rhythmical phrase or the melodic phrase in the top section is 5 notes long, and the bottom one is 4 notes long. And what this does is it'll add to a lot of really cool feelings. It'll add a really cool texture to your music, especially with an ascending line like this that just repeats. And eventually they fall back into sync. So for 4/4 and 5/4, that would fall back in after, I believe, 20 bars of that. It will sync back up with each other, and that's a really powerful moment musically. And this could be done with pretty much anything. You can have a 3/4 over 4/4, so that would line up after 12 bars, and so on. A really good way of thinking about this is it's equally sized marbles in differently sized jars, just for an interesting analogy to think about it. So the marbles would be the notes. The note sizes are the exact same. The different jars, those are the different time signature bars. So the top one, it's got 5, or it's a jar that can fit 5 marbles. They're all the same size, and the jar on the bottom that can fit 4 of those same sized marbles. All right, and now alternatively, you got polyrhythm, which means 2 or more rhythms happening at once. So this is different from polymeter in that it's differently sized marbles in the same size jar. So it's just close enough, but different enough to be confusing. So basically, each bar has their first beat coincide with each other, and each bar is the same length. So one bar of the 4/4 or the 4-beat thing is the same length as one bar of the 5-beat one, but you cram it in. So this is basically taking the tuplet idea and applying it to 2 rhythms playing at the same time. So for this would be a quintuplet being played against straight quarter notes. And usually you don't hear something like a 5/4 polyrhythm, which is how you would say it. That's 5 and then the colon is against 4. But a really common one that I'm sure everyone's heard is I believe it's called the Carol of the Bells. It's a 3/4 polyrhythm. And a good way to hear it is 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. So I'm sure all of you have heard that at some point in your life. It is very recognizable. It's probably the easiest polyrhythm to figure out, other than like a 2/4, which is just a normal drum beat. But yes, it is technically a polyrhythm. It's just not an interesting one, to say the least. But a 5/4 polyrhythm is a really interesting one because it visually shows, okay, this is a quintuplet basically, being played against quarter notes, and it can add to a really cool texture. So just once again, polymeter, equally sized marbles, different sized jars. Polyrhythm, differently sized marbles, so that's different sized notes, different length notes in 2 jars that are the same size. And one of the last things to talk about with rhythm, not the last though, just one of the last. Sorry. You got on and off beats. This is pretty much day 1 drumming lessons. And all these examples I'm just going to show in 4/4 just to keep it simple. But the beat 1 is the downbeat. This is the most powerful beat. It's the strongest one. It is the most likely place for a chord change in a bar. And it's also an on beat. And the 3 is also an on beat. Those are the 2 on beats. Generally, it's every other beat. So if it was a bar of 6/8, actually no, bad example, but generally, when it's the start of something, so like in 4/4, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. It's every other beat is the strong beat. For something like 6/8, where it's 2 3/8 things strung together. I don't know why I tried to use that as an example. I still can't speak. I still apologize. That would be the beat, or the strong beat is the 1 and also the 4, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because that's just how 6/8 works. But for something like 3/4, that would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's just emphasizing the 1. But yeah, moving on from that, the on beats are the likeliest places for chord changes. They're the most common places for chord changes. But then you got beats 2 and 4, which are off beats. So that's something that's not usually accented. If it is, it can be a little jarring, and it can make you feel like, oh, this feels like it might be in a different time, but it's not. That's really interesting. And a song that does this excellently is Bonnie the Cat by Porcupine Tree, which is another band I love and will shill at every chance I get. But that song, the main bass line for it starts on the 2nd 8th note. So it starts on the 1 and, which is really cool because the drum beat also emphasizes the 1 and 2 instead of the 1 and 3. So it feels really off kilter, but it's in 4/4. It's a really cool song. Highly recommend looking into it. But that leads directly into the next line: 8th, 16th, and so on beats. Those are the weakest beats. You generally won't find chord changes here. You generally won't find accents here. But if you do, like in Bonnie the Cat, it can add a lot of really cool things to it. And make things really interesting for the listener. And last but not least on the dock for today, we got syncopation, which is a big word. It's kind of scary, but very simply put, it is emphasizing the offbeats in the rhythm. So exactly what I was just talking about. There's not a ton to say here, but it is super important for interesting parts that keep the listener engaged. Once again, like Bonnie the Cat does, like a lot of songs do. And yeah, it is excellently used for drum parts with snare hits. So putting the snare on the 2 and the 4, it can be really interesting for the listener, or like doing different fills at different points that aren't as predictable as the 1 or the 3 can really add to the listening experience. It can make things super interesting. But yeah, right there, really good example. There's nothing played on the 1. There is something played on the 2 and the 4. And that's a tie between the 2 and the 3, so you won't be playing on the 3 either. This would be a really interesting feel. It would be interesting to count as well. And you could do a lot of really cool things with that. You can leave room for other notes to be played, like BFG division, for example. On the offbeats, when the guitar isn't playing, the snare punches right through into your face. And that's because nothing else is playing, and it's just the snare. So it's really cool. You could do a lot of really cool things with that. That BFG division technique really adds to the punch of the song, and I didn't really realize that until I was watching a Mick Gordon interview and he said that. But syncopating your music, syncopating the rhythm of your music, especially your melody or your harmonies, can let things punch through in a way that you couldn't normally if you're just sticking to 1 and 3. So, with all of that aside, what are some takeaways from this? What are some things that go beyond this info dump of a session that has gone for very long? Well, there's still a lot. As much as I crammed into this, there's honestly a comically large amount of things that I wanted to touch on, but just didn't have time for. You can look into a ridiculous amount of stuff for music. There's honestly a never-ending supply of information out there. And like I said towards the beginning, pretty much everything I covered today, except for a lot of the rhythmical concepts, most of that's just isolated to Western music theory, which just scratches the surface. Like when you go beyond that into like Eastern chords, exotic scales, microtonality, all that sort of thing, that really adds a lot of interesting character to what you're doing. Like right now, a lot of what I'm doing is exploring a lot of the exotic scales and Eastern chords, and just different types of music that way. Which kind of leads me into another really good point. If you're really curious about things, listening to different genres, particularly in my experience, jazz and progressive genres, can give you a lot of more insight into a ton of different unique things that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise. So with jazz and progressive genres in particular, I've learned a lot about polyrhythms, polymeter, and syncopation there. But even going beyond genres and listening to traditional music from different places is super eye-opening too. Like going from like dramatic piano solo pieces to like big orchestral pieces that were written in the modern day. Stuff like the things that Hans Zimmer does with different tribal influences with technology in there. You get traditional Japanese music, the more drum-oriented stuff from African and indigenous cultures. Things like throat singing, the different types of throat singing, Nordic music, didgeridoos, all that good stuff from all around the world throughout history. There is so much that you can look into, and it is so cool that all of this will just add to your knowledge pool and influence you in different ways when you're writing. And yeah, I at least find that ridiculously cool and fascinating. With all that aside, just one little side tangent once again about rhythm. If you're curious about more rhythmical concepts, definitely look up videos of Gavin Harrison. He's the drummer behind Porcupine Tree, so he's the one that figured out that doing the emphasis on the 1 and the 2 would be super weird for the listener. But he's insanely good, probably the best drummer on the planet. He does some frankly unbelievable things, and there's no shortage of videos of him explaining in depth a lot of the cool things he does, with a lot of examples too, which is really cool. So look into that if you're curious. One of the biggest things he does is overriding, which is such a cool concept. I could talk about that for a while. But yeah, here's just a bunch of things on one big slide that you can look into if this wasn't enough for you, which I would expect this is enough, but granted, there's always more to look into, which is the beauty of music. So, thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening to me rant for an hour and 16 minutes now. Next week, we're going to be opening, opening the shades to look into what my workflow looks like through a real-time composing session. It'll probably be terrible, but I hope to at least provide some insight on how I at least have learned to get started with making some adaptive music for games. I won't go too crazy with it. Hopefully I'll keep it within the span of an hour next time. But yeah, next time, real-time composing. Hope you come out for that. And yeah, thanks for listening.